Here we are on the Sidebar podcast. I'm so excited to have two of my friends, Daniel Valentine, Cynthia Fluker, joining me today. How are you two doing today?
Pretty good, pretty good.
Well.
Good. Okay, so here's the deal. I am a sucker for a good lyric, a wordsmithed hook in a song. I almost always walk around with like a lyric stuck in my head, and I'm just like over and over and over and over and over again, singing it, saying it, whatever. So here's a song. Austin Richard Post, better known as Post Malone,
very fancy
popular.
name.
That's right. Has a song called Circles. Over 1.6 billion streams on Spotify, nominated
Crazy.
for Record of the Year and Song of the Year in 2021 Grammys. And here's a chorus lyric that I get it stuck in my head sometimes. Seasons change and our love went cold. Feed the flame cause we can't let it go. That's a good lyric. That's a hook.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's kind of like a perfect depiction of just where we are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seasons change, everything changes, and just circle, like the cycle of everything that's happening now has happened before. And I mean, you can take so many different things from it.
Yeah. And it's faster than normal seasons. Like I
Yes.
feel like in pandemic everything was sped up, like change was
Absolutely.
constant.
Yep.
And I think with this lyric, I just think of our love went cold is such a crazy thing to experience. But yet feeding the flame because we can't let go, but you keep running back
Yeah.
to that person and yet the problem stays the same.
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
brings
And
us
it's
to
like a
this-
vicious cycle that just keeps
Yeah.
repeating itself. And I think it's interesting because like the lyrics are fairly heavy, but the tune's a little bit more pop, whatever. And so you lose maybe the weightiness of it. And it feels like, as I've been listening to the song and even analyzing the lyrics a little bit, it's this really interesting thing, like you said, that seasons do change. Like the reality,
Yeah.
I was thinking about, like, they just changed. It's just a matter of fact. Like, try to stop a season from changing.
Right.
You can't do that. And then, like, for us in life, there's a good side to that. Like, there's a goodness to seasons changing. There's a goodness of winter is followed by spring and summer comes. And so that's a part of like nature, but it's also a part of human nature. And it's a good thing, like if we're stuck and we never change, we don't mature, we don't develop. But then when it feels like it's a revolving door, a merry-go-round, like it's changing again and again and again, vicious cycle. Like, how do we get out of this? And the answer sort of that the song has is just throw it away if it's not working anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
We live in like a disposable culture that's like, okay, this no longer works. I'm going to get rid of it, move on to next and hope for better. And it's like, well, that's not the answer either.
Yeah.
That's not the
Yeah.
answer either. It's not going to always fix it just to change circumstances. Or in a relational conversation like this is, it's like, well, I'm not going to ever address the heart of the issue. I'm just going to go on to next,
Yeah.
and throw away something. And I think it really does speak to something culturally that goes on. Maybe
for
now more than
sure.
ever.
For sure.
Yeah.
I think that now change, it's either you want change and you're excited to change,
Right.
or it's you don't want
Yeah.
things to
Like
Yeah,
change.
you're just fighting against
Paralyzation.
it.
Yeah.
Yes, and it's like when people and things start to change, you automatically think that it's negative.
Right.
And you're like, oh, I got to get out of this. And change is inevitable, like you were just saying. But I feel like the biggest thing to know is when it's healthy change and when it's the change where you do need to get out.
That's good.
And even talking about like fighting for relationships or fighting the change and stuff, we do live in a culture that's like, well, if it doesn't benefit me, then I'm leaving. And that's how relationships are viewed. If I'm not having fun anymore, if this relationship is too hard, then I'm just going to leave. And so honestly, like that's one of my questions for you guys is when it comes to dating and relationships, when it starts getting hard, you're not tied down by a covenant like you are in marriage. And so I would love to know your guys' opinion on that. Like when changes come in dating, pre-marriage, and you keep returning to the same fight, when do you decide, like, are we fighting for this or are we backing out?
Yeah.
Well, okay, so now let's just be like where we're coming from. So I've been married for a long time. I'm like 21 and a half years. Cynthia, how long have you been married?
Almost 10 now.
Okay, so here's the single lady asking the two married people
Yes,
dating
sorry, I have
questions.
so much dating.
So we have some experience, but it's maybe back in the past a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think it's a great question because I think sometimes we stick around in relationships that we should have just moved on with a long time ago, and at other times we stay, just like probably bound.
Yeah.
And so do we move on too fast? Do we move on too slow? How do we navigate this? And for me, it comes down to the core of when we're looking at somebody maybe to date or to marry, it's probably best to look at someone that we could see growing and changing together with, experiencing different seasons. And, sometimes you don't learn that until you date for a while and you go through some seasons. And experiencing different seasons helps you to then say, okay, we navigate the seasons. I could see us navigating this together. But I think at the end of the day, let's just be honest, you don't know.
Yeah.
You don't know till you go through it. You don't know how people are going to respond in different things. Like I was thinking, practically, what does it mean to change? What does it mean for different seasons? And we've talked about this, the three of us, like the pandemic brought out things in different people that we've got people that we know that are like, I don't even recognize my spouse anymore.
Yeah.
They've
Yeah, for
changed.
sure.
I don't recognize my family anymore. Or this person I'm dating, they've changed and what's been brought up from the pandemic. I don't like or I don't know. And so part of this is, how do we stay committed no matter what? Well, that's a married person talking with a ring on it.
Right.
In dating, it's a little bit different. And so there has to be sort of this foundational understanding value system that you agree upon. We're coming at this from a Christian perspective. So we're hoping that Christ is the commonality that helps endure a bunch of other things. But the reality is, you just don't know until you go through some seasons sometimes.
That's very true. From my experience, me and Frank.
Oh, now we're getting real.
Call them out.
Right.
Me and Frank were one of those couples in
that's
the
good.
beginning, the on again, off again. And sometimes it was his fault. Sometimes it was my fault.
Oh, that was nice of you. That was a gracious way of saying it.
Thank you. But the times that it was my fault, it was because I had changed and then I wanted him to change too. And I didn't respect his journey of change. So
good.
God was working on him in another way, but I'm like, okay, well, I'm already here and I need you to hurry up and get where I am because now I have learned this and I've grown. And so if you're not where I am, then I can't stay with you.
Yeah.
And that was totally unfair of me, and I broke up with him. But I mean, he's my husband now, so everything is great. But even in marriage, I see myself still falling back to that same thing sometimes. If I learn something, I automatically expect him to be where I am. So it's really respecting other people's journey and letting God work on them. Like, we are not God. We can't change anybody. But if you are committed to them, even in a dating sense, respect the process. But there are some things that you need to move on from. Like when there's a pattern of broken trust, when they've shown you who they are, it's not going to change when you get married.
Yeah.
So if they've shown you that that's a thing and it's common, you kind of have to move on. Of course, any form of abuse, mental abuse, all the things, you got to move on. And I know I'm talking a lot.
That's good.
But I also feel that sometimes people stay in relationships just because of the way it looks and other people's expectations of them.
Yeah. And I think you see that especially around church. People want to stay in relationships because it's glorified and looks amazing. And we love when people get married here. But how many times do you see that couple or that relationship actually have brokenness in it that they're not addressing?
Yeah.
And not addressing the changes that are happening. Like you say, you change, Frank changes, but then you want him to change. It's a lot of just expectations placed on this relationship.
And to those who are single, it's always better to do this work before you get married than to think you're going to get married and then do the work.
Yeah.
And it's I would think infinitely more complicated once you are married.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it feels also strangling because there's a commitment that's been made. And so the good work is to be done. The best work is to be done before you get married. Now, for those who are married, that doesn't mean don't do the work. For those who are married, it's recognizing their growing pains in a relationship, and there's a constant need to work at a relationship. And sometimes that's working on it together. Sometimes that's asking friends to assist, walk alongside of you. Sometimes it's like, no, we need counseling. We need somebody that knows what they're doing to help us journey through this together. And it's never, there's never shame in saying we need some help. We all need some help.
Yes.
It's to what degree do we need help, and where's the appropriate place to get that help from?
Yeah. And as for changes in marriage, I think there's a lot of moments where we've had this is what I believe, whether it's I want a family or this is my political preference, honestly. And then we get into marriage and change happens, as change should happen. But how does that work in a marriage? Because now you have a covenant and you're saying my spouse wanted this and now they want this. How have you guys approached change in marriage?
Yeah.
I mean,
Do you have thoughts?
changes. I mean, it just happens, and you kind of have to roll with the punches. But personally, for me, when things have changed, I'm just going to say it. I've always dreamed of having a big family. I have so many brothers. I've come from a house large. And so I was like, okay, I want kids everywhere. And Frank was the only child. But he wanted kids too. So we get married and we think, we have this dream and we're going to have a bunch of kids. And then you realize, you come to find out that you can't have kids. And so that's a change. It's like a death of a dream that you've always thought you were going to have. And so now your marriage has changed. And it could be a permanent change. And it's like, oh, shoot, now we have to relearn each other and kind of re-envision what life is and what we want our marriage to be. And so it's really just growing together as you change, because it's going to happen. Dreams that you had, career choices, it all changes. But we could not get through any of that stuff without communicating. Because that's the biggest part. The times that we did not communicate, it's when we got in the biggest arguments, when change happened.
No, absolutely. That's good. I had two words pop into my head when you said that. It was conversations and expectations. And you just spoke to it. Like, if we can't keep talking, like the reality is change is a fact. If you're married, you're going to change. Your partner's going to change. It's how do we change in a way that we can grow together, not grow apart. And that takes conversation. So, like, on the one hand, I totally agree with you. It's conversations, and it's often asking questions, not just talking and getting to the heart of that person. But it's also a changing and an adjustment of expectations. If you have a dream and there's somewhat of a death of some kind of a dream, then there's an adjustment, and expectations have to adjust as well. And sometimes we have a lot of trouble adjusting expectations. And expectations are sometimes adjusted because circumstances demand it, or because of another person sort of needs that. And we have to have an understanding, like an expectation. My wife and I were in counseling one time, and the therapist brought up this idea of, well, what is an expectation? It's something two people have agreed upon. And if the other person hasn't agreed upon it, then you can't hold them to that expectation.
For
Like, oh, okay, well, that was an assumption then. Or a presumption. And so to be able to say, no, this is a real deal expectation. So, the Bible's clear. Like Ecclesiastes, old school, Old Testament, there is a time for everything, Ecclesiastes 3 says. A season for every activity under heaven. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to tear down. All of that kind of stuff. There's a time for all of this. And so Scripture talks about there's just seasonal things. I grew up in North Carolina. We had 4 distinct seasons. Now, out here in California, sometimes it's like it's just all the same season, right? It's sunny and beautiful. And but recognizing what season you're in is so important. And so for a single person, relationally, here we are close to Valentine's Day, and it's like recognizing the season. Is it filled with expectations of good, or sort of expectations of this is going to be hard? And recognizing that season, anticipating that. For married couples, expecting, like, if you're in a newlywed season versus you've been married a long time, young kids, there's just these expectations and seasons that have to be adjusted. At the heart of, I think, what maybe makes all the difference in this conversation, you brought it up, you said the word covenant. That is us coming to marriage and relationships with a Christian perspective.
Yeah.
That we believe it's not just an agreement that a couple of us make together, husband and wife, but it's something that we've invited God into the center of. And I love in Matthew 19, Jesus is sort of on the hot seat. And the Pharisees, these religious people, are trying to get him to like give into divorce. It's almost they're trying to get him to give into the Post Malone circles and seasons thing.
Yeah.
If it's not working out, just toss in the towel and go somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so they're asking, like, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? And Jesus does something fascinating. He doesn't go back to anybody's definition of marriage. He goes back way further. He goes back to the beginning, to creation. And this is what Jesus says. Haven't you read that at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female? For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Jesus goes to the very, very beginning of even creation's story of what it means to be human. And he says, God, in this act that God created, marriage, joins and two become one.
Yeah.
And so now it's more than just a contract. It's a
Yes.
covenant where God is at the center of this. And we believe once you make that commitment, that God wants you to honor that commitment, no matter the seasons and the circles that you go through. Sometimes easier said than done, right?
Oh, for
And
sure.
we know there are extreme circumstances that there are other scriptures that talk to, but at the core, there's a covenant. There's a commitment that God says, when I've joined together, I don't want it to be separate. And sometimes we come to life with like an escape plan.
Yeah.
Or I think we talked about some groups we have where married couples are having to decide, do we throw the divorce word off the table? Because
Yes.
it's a weapon that can
It
be
is.
used, right?
It
How did that
is.
conversation, I mean, you don't have to name names, but how'd that conversation go?
Absolutely. And ironically, it came from a lot of our women. It's all right. Sometimes we make mistakes.
Women want to use the word
Well, let's
divorce,
just-
or men. Okay.
But using that word, it's really just like Aaron was saying, taking divorce off the table, even in arguments. Sometimes we don't really believe that we're gonna actually divorce our spouse, but sometimes when we're so angry, we bring that topic up.
Yeah.
And it's so unfair because you don't even realize how crushing that is to your spouse. And they might not even realize that you're just saying it to push a button. They're like, wait, you could actually leave me? Like, that's in your heart? You have the capacity to leave me like that?
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of us were like, wow. I didn't really think about how that affected the other person.
It was more reactive than it was thought through.
Absolutely. And so just taking that off the table, closing all those back doors within your marriage. Because, we always leave some type of door open. But the idea of marriage is to close all those doors. So it's literally you and your spouse.
Which is the definition of circles.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
if you have this card that you can throw out at any time, it's like, well, what do I do with that? It just breeds uncertainty again and again.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's this pastor out of Australia, Mark Sayers, and he was talking, I remember, and I just couldn't get away from this analogy about we have three tanks. These three tanks that we live out of: meaning, freedom, and community. And the three have to stay balanced. And anytime we're out of balance, it's at the expense of another. So he talks about commitment and community. It's a limiting of our freedom. So the moment that I'm saying I'm married, I've put limits on my freedom. I've got limits on my freedom sexually because I'm married and I'm committed to my wife. And so it's like there's a limit. And in order to honor the community part, you have to limit the freedom part. But like we live in the West that sort of wants the freedom one to overflow. And who cares about meaning and community because we want freedom. But what we do if we let it overflow is we undermine community. Why don't I have depth of relationship and trust? Because we're trying to live out of the freedom all the time? Why don't I have true meaning?
Yeah.
Because we're out of balance. And he says you've got to have the three of those in balance
Yeah.
to
That's
experience
good.
sort of the fullness of that unity Jesus talks about in marriage. And that's why it matters so much. That's why the Post Malone vision of circles, it's like that rat race. It's unfulfilling
It really
Yeah.
and
is.
it doesn't give life. And there's more that God has designed us for. And if it's in marriage, God's designed that not to complete us, but for us to experience him together. And if it's as a single person, it's not saying, well, I have to be married to be complete. No, 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 no. It's saying as a single person, I can experience the fullness of God, his love, his grace, the relationship of other people without a spouse. And God ultimately brings the one that fulfills us. So we don't have to look to another person to stay in the circle, in the seasons, in the endless cycle, in the monotony, because God himself is the one that brings that relational sort of fulfillment in our lives.
Absolutely. And that's another thing that's really huge in some of the conversations that I've had with married couples.
Yeah.
It's putting unrealistic expectations on their spouse that only things that God can fulfill. Like they're trying to get all of their happiness from their spouse. And so when they feel like they're not met in those ways, they're like, oh, it's all you. It's all you. When it's like, wait, no, this isn't here. So until you get this, this is always going to be
That's
wrong.
good. No, that's
And that's
so
almost to wrap it all up in saying that, seasons change, but God never does.
good. Never.
Yes.
And so if something is going to stay the same in our relationships, it's going to be our relationship with God.
Yeah.
That is something that should not change.
And it puts the responsibility back on us. At the end of the day, you and I, we're the ones who are responsible for our response to God. See, God is gracious, abundant in his grace, but we have to seek him for that. So at the end of the day, another person can never do that. And so when we take personal responsibility for our lives, and specifically our lives before God, in seeking him for ourselves, we find the fulfillment. Then we don't have to go looking for somebody else to give that.
Yes. Well, I think we wrapped it all
That's
up.
enough of Post
with
Malone
this.
for me.
But that's great because next week we got to talk about forgiveness.
Yes,
and we're hitting
forgiveness.
on "Sorry" by Justin
The
Bieber.
Biebs, we're coming for you. You're next.
Yes. So tune in next week for "Sorry" by Justin Bieber.
There you go.
Maybe Cynthia will sing a little ditty for us.
Oh, I like that idea.
Okay.
Great being with you guys today.
Absolutely.
Seasons change and our love won't go. Feed the flame cause we can't let go. Run away cause we're running in circles. Run away, dare you to do something. Waiting on you.